Hello, I'm George Malin, the Managing Editor of IoT Now, and welcome to today's webinar, the topic of which is, will your new IoT device break your business? How to design, develop, and deploy a secure, trustworthy IoT product. As IoT devices continue to move towards the mainstream, this is a timely and intense topic for organizations to get to grips with, and the stakes are extremely high. Bringing a secure and trusted device to market enables you to participate and take a leading role in your market, because customers will have the confidence to adopt and utilize that device and value the service it provides to the extent they may even pay for it. However, the flip side is that getting this wrong can undermine trust and cause severe brand damage. Devices should therefore be secure by design, and this has been adopted as a code of practice in the UK, and other nations are expected to follow. It's easily said, the phrase secure by design, but it's hard to achieve, and this webinar sets out to explain the steps organizations need to go through to ensure compliance with secure by design principles. The complexity of this developmental journey shouldn't be underestimated, and I'm therefore delighted to welcome today's speakers to shed light onto the complicated, risky process of moving from early fire-and-forget IoT devices to an end-to-end managed solution. From Consult Red, we have Stuart Griffin, a founding director and technologist, and Rahul Mehra, the Chief Technology Officer, also at Consult Red. Consult Red's heritage is in securing digital devices, such as the set-top boxes used in the pay TV industry, and the company has been doing that for many, many years. However, more recently, the company has widened its focus to bring its expertise to other forms of secure IoT device development and deployments. And I guess that's going to be probably the substance of today's presentations. Stuart and Rahul are joined by Matt Hatton, the managing partner of analyst firm Transformer Insights, who is going to update us on the security issues facing IoT devices and look ahead to how the market is developing. Before I hand over to Matt, I should point out that all our speakers will be staying on after the presentations to take questions from the audience. To participate, simply enter your question into the panel on the screen, and I will put it to the presenters later on. Now, to set the scene, we're going to have a poll to gauge audience understanding of the issues, and the poll is shortly going to pop up on your screen. And the question is, have you adopted the Secure by Design Code of Practice? And the possible answers are, I've never heard of it, I'm aware but haven't started, it's partially adopted, and finally, all products are compliant already. So we'll just wait a bit for the voting to settle down. And obviously, I think the early running seems to demonstrate that it's early days for the Code of Practice, and I don't think it's a huge surprise to see almost half of people have never heard of it. So that's great that you're on this event, because we're going to bring you up to date, and a third are aware of it, which is, I think, probably very good news. Anyway, without further ado, let's close the poll, and we'll move on to the first presentation, which will be from Matt Hatton at Transformer Insights. Matt, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, George. Hello. As George said, I'm Matt Hatton. I'm one of the founding partners at Transformer Insights. We're a technology industry analyst firm. I'm here to set the scene a little bit on the IoT and explain a bit about the background to why you need to take more care of stitching security into your product development process. It wouldn't be an analyst presentation without some forecasts, so I've put them here. Up front, the IoT is already pretty big. 7.6 billion connected devices, generating a little bit shy of $500 billion in 2019. Going to continue to grow. By 2030, we expect 24.1 billion devices, generating $1.5 trillion. It's a diverse world, covering an almost infinite number of possible applications, from consumer devices like smartwatches through to complex industrial systems covering things like healthcare, manufacturing, and logistics. So IoT is big, and it's going to get even bigger. But more important is the impact that it'll have on organizations that are deploying it. So rather than focusing on the numbers of billions of devices or trillions of dollars of revenue, it's possibly more helpful to think about the ways in which IoT can be used by enterprises. At one end of the spectrum, you've got simple monitoring and solutions like remote sensors, alarms, number plate recognition, connected rat traps, any number of imaginable sensors. Essentially, this is companies using IoT as a way to complement existing business practices. And most IoT is here today. We've undertaken a lot of research recently looking at some real-world implementations of IoT, and the findings were pretty clear from that. The vast majority of deployments were aimed at internal efficiency savings rather than product upgrades or the more transformational business models. IoT adoption is dominated by this low-hanging fruit. There is a distinct aversion to deployments that are overly complex in perhaps more than one dimension. Reducing complexity clearly is the key to unlocking the more sophisticated use cases, such as shown on this slide towards the right-hand side, at the other end of the spectrum, things that are more transformational, where adoption involves a radical change to how organizations operate, which has implications for most aspects of how they work. Take, for instance, the as-a-service business model. This involves the company switching from selling products to providing them as a service, supported by remote monitoring, hence the interest for IoT. There's numerous examples of this, including Rolls-Royce selling engines on a per-kilometre flow model. So this isn't necessarily a new thing, but there is an opportunity with IoT technologies and the reducing barriers to entry and the reducing costs to democratize this type of business model, allowing smaller and smaller organizations the opportunity to use this kind of approach as a differentiator. Take, for example, a company like Tomra, which makes potato sorting machines. For them, it would involve switching from selling the machines to providing the hardware up front and charging per potato sorted, or more likely per ton of potato sorted. We can kind of think of this as potato sorting as a service. And what IoT does, it opens up the opportunity for organizations to address those potential new business models. So as we can see, a broad range of business models, all facilitated by IoT. And as we saw in the previous slide, billions more devices. But enormous though the opportunity might be, it hasn't quite achieved what we've hoped over the last 10 years. About 10 years ago, you may remember, there were predictions of 50 billion connected devices in 2020. Well, we're in 2020, and guess what? No 50 billion connected devices. That was the starting point for a book I wrote that was published back in April. That book was called The Internet of Things Myth. In that book, we went on to explore some of the reasons why IoT has failed to deliver on those promises, and here's a small selection of those reasons. There were some stupid product ideas, many of which you'd have seen walking the halls at CES a few years ago. Plenty of things that shouldn't have seen the light of day, like connected toothbrushes and connected kettles and so forth. The utility, if there really was any, didn't match the additional cost that was implicit with those devices. It's worth noting that the connected fridge, the fabled connected fridge, which was supposed to tell you when you were running out of eggs, isn't really one of these useless models. It's just that the value isn't in having the user pay for it. It's in providing information back to the manufacturer on how that product is being used in the field. Which brings us on to the next issue, implementation. Good ideas done badly. One fundamental issue is the inherent conflict between the software world on the one hand and the hardware world. Sometimes what we look at here feels more like the internet versus things than the Internet of Things. For software developers, there's high fault tolerance. There can be beta testing in field, for instance. Whereas hardware developers face much more rigorous field testing, high compliance requirements, and are generally much slower to market. This friction sometimes leads to a porting of internet practices into the physical world that just aren't acceptable. Sonos and Philips, for instance, got some pretty bad publicity recently for announcing that they were stopping supporting devices. That kind of behavior might be acceptable for software, but isn't really for music or lighting systems that historically people might have expected to last for decades. Next up is commercial issues. IoT is often deployed by the IT department, and that's a fundamental problem. The problem is that they don't tend to give consideration for how the wider organization will need to change. This leads to repeated technical proofs of concept that don't go anywhere. POC hell, as I've described it in the past. Companies need commercial and operational changes to run alongside the technical. There's also a bunch of things that seem like a good idea, seem like a logical idea for IoT deployments, just that they don't quite fit into how the real world works. Take connected bins, for instance. The theory is a good one. Connect every bin to know when it needs emptying. Great idea. Makes sense, right? Yes, except it's only useful if it actually streamlines the process. Can you really adapt your processes to make them more efficient? It turns out to really take advantage of connected bins, what you need is an Uber of bins with independent freelancers collecting refuse on an ad hoc basis, something that is never going to work. Finally, I want to zero in on security. This is more of a chronic problem. A lack of faith in security leads to slower adoption. We've seen security breaches ranging from the Jeep hacking to the Ring Santa Claus incident, which was frankly disturbing. If you've not heard about it, I recommend you go take a look. All the way to the rather more benign, shall we say, Mirai botnet. Well, more benign, I guess, if you weren't on the receiving end of the associated DDoS attacks. They all contributed to this underlying message that the IoT was somehow insecure, with a potential knock-on effect on adoption. There's an element with all of these things, with all of these challenges that we've seen over the last 10 years, of immaturity. All of them do seem to be improving. Security, for instance, seems to be improving as people get to grips much more with the requirements and as there is general increase in maturity. Also helping is an increase in regulation. We've seen a recent flurry of regulations aimed specifically at IoT. Now, there has been regulation that has been associated with IoT for a very long time. Things to do with what you can do with spectrum for connecting devices, for instance. But this is the first IoT-specific regulation. In the US, the recent California law is effectively a national law, since it covers any company that counts California residents amongst its customers, covers any device that's assigned an IP or a Bluetooth address and is capable of connecting directly or indirectly to the internet. It mandates things like a requirement for unique pre-programmed passwords, but it's mostly light on specifics. There's also quite a bit of uncertainty about enforcement and penalties. Switching to the UK, the new legislation has three main requirements. IoT device passwords must be unique and not resettable to universal factory settings. Manufacturers must provide a public contact point as part of a vulnerability disclosure policy. And manufacturers must explicitly state the minimum length of time during which the device will receive security updates. The UK also works with ETSI and continues to do so, the ETSI being a standards organization which has put in place 13 recommendations for default passwords, software updates, and so forth. Obviously, ETSI is not a regulator, it's a standards body, but useful input nonetheless. And on the subject of Europe, ETSI, the E in ETSI being for Europe, the EU Cyber Security Act arrived in 2020, creating a framework for obtaining and sharing certificates to verify levels of assurance. Voluntary scheme, though. The Act also established ENISA, the EU Agency for Cybersecurity, which released its own good practices for security of IoT in November 2019, which focused on ensuring that security is baked into the software development lifecycle for IoT. But it only includes good practices and guidelines rather than regulations. I'd also note that there are other initiatives for instance, from the so-called Five Eyes of UK, Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand, who have have issued a statement of intent on IoT security as well. And Japan, there was a set of regulation or guidelines published in 2019. So these things are coming. Lots of positive measures, but there are a lot of people who would say that these don't go far enough. Some of the recommendations are vague. They're often voluntary. The penalties are weak, and there's a risk that people will think that once they've complied with these rules, whichever set they think applies to them, that they're secure. Whereas the picture is much more complex than that. And speaking of complexity, finally, I want to put security into context by introducing another idea here of trustworthiness. We've worked closely with an organization called the Industrial Internet Consortium on this topic. We hear a lot about you can't have too much security, but that misses 2 points. A focus on security alone risks missing the point about a wider concept of trustworthiness. You need to consider security alongside, say, safety or reliability or resilience or privacy. They're all linked, but they're definitely not the same thing. Secondly, you need to consider the commercial impact of all of your actions, both positive and negative, on things like profitability, churn, time to market, and so forth. You definitely can have too much security because it's always going to be a trade-off with these other elements. And you need to constantly review and iterate to make sure the levels of security and other aspects of trustworthiness are fit for purpose and appropriate. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Stuart from Consult Red. Stuart, over to you.
Thanks, Matt, for that interesting introduction. I think, as George mentioned at the beginning, I'm Stuart Griffin, and I'm one of the founders of Consult Red. And I've been working with and helping customers develop secure embedded devices for about 15 years, in fact, for all of my career. Before I get into our approach to security by design, I just want to spend a little bit of time introducing Consult Red and who we are. We're an independent development partner. We have about 150 engineers working out of 3 development centres, one in the UK, one in Poland, and one in the US. We've been going for about 15 years, and in that time, most of our work has been for people like Virgin and Sky, Comcast, AT&T, people like that, where we've worked on set-top boxes and broadband gateways. I would say that our technology is probably in around 30 million homes. So, we've got some experience. More recently, we've also been working on some IoT projects. We've done some vehicle-to-grid charging, connected smoke alarms, and telemetry for vending machines. Our work with set-top boxes in particular has been quite helpful because these are typically conveying premium content. So they have to be very secure. They'll use trusted execution environments, multiple security kernels. They'll be security audited and they'll be pen tested, and also very complicated devices. So we've been leveraging that security experience into our IoT work. And I'm going to talk about how we approach secure by design. So as you can see from this slide, we've kind of broken our approach to security by design into 7 stages. And I think the first thing that I want to say about those 7 stages is they don't just span the design phase of developing a product, they actually span the entire lifetime of the product. If we're going to maintain security, we need to be thinking about it for the entire lifetime of the product. And a lot of the regulations that Matt's mentioned are very much focused on this idea that you've got to do it for the lifetime of the product. And the way that we've also enhanced our approach is we've tried to work in the UK Code of Practice, which might sound like a very UK-centric approach. And I'm just going to talk about the Code of Practice for a little while first. But actually, the ETSI standard, is almost identical. There's been tremendous alignment between the UK and Europe on this. In fact, the ETSI standard, I would say, is that the UK document's a good introduction, but I would say the ETSI standard is probably the better document, providing a bit more detail. And as Matt mentioned, I'd just like to draw, rather than going through all of these guidelines one by one, and I think if you can just see the titles there, you'll probably agree that most of them are good, make sense, a good practice. But I'd just like to draw your attention to the first three. These are the no default passwords, implement a vulnerability disclosure policy, and keep software updated. Now, these are the three where there seems to be a real focus on regulation. So these are the three that we certainly have to have in the front of our mind when we're developing a product. And not just in the UK, there are proposals even within the EU at the moment for a certification framework. So things may become less voluntary in the future. Okay, so the first step we consider on our process for doing secure by design is requirement analysis. And actually, the code of practice is very helpful here because it immediately identifies some functional requirements that we might want to include and we may have overlooked, such as not having default passwords. But there is actually also a complementary document that the UK government has produced. There's even a website that goes along with this, and that's a mapping between the code of practice and a whole range of, this is a 200-page document, and a whole range of industry standards. And I think that's a very good reference document when you're going through your requirement analysis, because it gives you the opportunity to see if there are relevant certification, relevant industry body codes of practice, such as codes of practice from the IoT Security Foundation, and relevant standards that you might want to adopt as part of your requirements. This list isn't exhaustive, so if you work in a highly regulated area such as healthcare or aviation or something like that, then there will be applicable standards that you'll need to consider as well. Whilst you're doing the requirement analysis at that early stage, before you've invested too much time and effort, it's a good idea to evaluate whether you've got the right level of security. Are you taking a proportionate approach? At this time, we haven't gone and done lots of development. We haven't invested in lots of hardware and software. So this is the time to do that. And it is a judgment. It is a judgment. There aren't hard and fast rules. Obviously, regulation helps, but it's really a judgment. It's also a time to consider whether you can optimize your requirements and challenge, do I really need to store that sensitive data? If I don't store that sensitive data, I don't have to protect it, and things become simpler and easier. And the other thing that we have found during the requirement analysis that is often overlooked is the user impact experience. Often the user impact experience is considered for what software engineers would call the happy path. But when you consider some of the negative use cases, what would happen if my bootloader failed and I was unable to run and execute the main code? How would I communicate that to the user? How would the user know what to do? Then a lot of those aren't considered, and it is worth considering those up front because they can create operational difficulties later. The next step in our process is an attack surface analysis. Now, first of all, what do we mean by an attack surface? Well, we're talking about a physical, a digital, or a logical interface that an attacker might exploit. And the very first thing we try and do is minimize the number of attack surfaces. If we remove the attack surface, we remove the opportunity for those exploitations. Now, we're not going to be able to remove all the attack surfaces. So then for each attack surface, we need to consider the threats. What are the potential threats that are enabled by that attack surface? This can't be done exhaustively. There's not an exhaustive for every attack surface. There's not an exhaustive list of threats, and new threats are emerging all the time. So it will take some experience and it will take some investigation to understand what the potential threats are. There are some tools that can help. You may have heard of something like Stride, which is a mnemonic to make you think of certain types of attack that you should perhaps consider during this process. And I think the other thing to say about attack surface analysis is it's an iterative process. As you go through the design, you're likely to reveal new attack surface, new threats will occur to you, and you're going to have to go back around this loop. Once we've identified an attack on a particular a threat on a particular attack surface, what we generally do is follow a deter, prevent, detect, correct approach. So what does that mean? Well, that means the first thing we think about is, can we deter this threat from in the first place? Can we remove the motivation? Can we not store that sensitive data, or not convey that data over this particular communications? The second thing we think about is how we can protect or prevent, and that's about using standard best practice cryptographic tools to protect that situation and stop that and stop that threat. And the next thing we consider is detect. Suppose the attacker is successful. How would we know they've been successful? How can we detect this? What logging, what telemetry, what measures could we have to detect it? And then finally, what we think about is, if the attacker was successful, what would our remediation be? How would we correct the situation? I mean, this might be a software update, or it might be something as simple as a password reset. Okay, so now we move on to the meat of the process, and we start to think about design and development. Now, nowadays, and certainly most of the systems that we work with, the design and development process is very much about integration. Generally, you're going to be bringing in lots of components together, big software components together. And selecting these components is really important. Are they, how secure are the components that you're selecting? Are they going to have updates over the lifetime of the product? Is the supplier going to keep telling you about vulnerabilities? Do they have a vulnerability disclosure policy that's going to mean you know about these vulnerabilities? And this also applies for open source components. Are these being actively maintained? Are there forums and database where those open source components are being, the threats and the vulnerabilities are being collected and disseminated? But there will be inevitably some new code. And although new code may only actually be a small part of the total lines of software in the product, studies have shown it does introduce a disproportionate number of vulnerabilities. So we need to follow some good practices when we're developing our new code. In particular, we want to be following the practices of partitioning the system, and that applies to the integration as well. Even when you're integrating, partitioning can be very important. Another good practice to follow is the practice of least privilege. So you can minimize the impact of a particular component being compromised. We also want to be sure that we minimize the number of vulnerabilities we're introducing. So we want to be thinking about reviewing that code as well, and testing. A lot of testing on products very much focuses on the functional, on how the product works. But when you bring security into the equation, you probably can think about expanding your testing. Maybe we can introduce more stress testing. Maybe introduce some fuzzy testing, perhaps some impaired network testing, and this may reveal some vulnerabilities in the design. Now, depending on the application, you may need to be achieve a higher level of security. And if you are aiming for a high level of security, then it can be a very good idea to introduce some external security audit. So rather than marking your own homework, get an external expert in to examine the design and evaluate it. And you might want to add to that some penetration testing. If you're using some standard software stacks, these guys have a library that will exercise known vulnerabilities and can give you some insight into whether you've got an issue there you need to fix. During the design process, you're going to have to make some big decisions about, certainly around key component selection. And today we've got our CTO with us, Rahul Mehra, and he's going to talk about 3 of those big decisions you're going to need to make throughout the development process.
Thanks, Stuart. Hi. My name's Rahul Mehra. I'm one of the founders, and as Stuart has said, I'm CTO of Red Embedded, and I and the teams at Consult Red have been doing several IoT projects in the recent past and in our careers. So, as Stuart said, I'm going to cover a couple of big decisions, and the first one of which is SoC, System on Chip selection. And really, this is about making our choice of device proportionate. And that might mean we need little or no extra security. And we may settle for a one-time programmable memory. And that's really there to establish a root of trust so that you know that the software that we put in at the factory and the keys that we put in cannot be modified as they leave. Ball grid arrays also make it harder for people in the field to interfere with the device. So moving on. So an example of that actually is a temperature sensor, a consumer temperature sensor. Moving on, the next stage basically start introducing additional blocks. So the example here would be cryptographic acceleration. So AES is a symmetric, well proven, well hardened cipher. So that's normally put in for efficiency. Also, at this sort of level, you introduce fuses, for example, to stop debugging ports, or to lock the boot vector, or to prevent the reading of the code from the chip. An example of this sort of level of security may be a Bluetooth connected heart rate monitor. Moving up to the mid-level, things become interesting at this level. So we're now starting to introduce hardware such as secure boot or encrypted boot code, and that's really to ensure that those secrets and the code are unmodified, and are ensuring that that root of trust is nailed down further. We also, at this stage, start introducing partitioning of the system to protect and demarcate areas of responsibilities. So a memory protection unit is a piece of hardware that polices access to portions of the chip, maybe for cryptographic acceleration, or for some peripherals, or to memory. Also, another interesting item that gets added at this layer is a true random number generator. Now, random numbers are used throughout the cryptographic processes. So in challenge response and nonce type protocols. And what a true random number generator ensures is that from device to device and from boot to boot, the random number cannot be predicted, and that is the root of security for some of these protocols. Also at this sort of level is we start introducing secure debug. So that's an affordance really for development or for in service, where people would actually like access to the device, but only if authorized. An example of this sort of level of security may be a smoke alarm aggregator for remote monitoring. At the top level, there are increasing amounts of hardware added to systems on chips. So advanced cryptographic processes, which is typically asymmetric public key cryptography functions. Normally, this goes hand in hand with a key vault for both the algorithm and the keys. And that, again, is to partition the system, to demarcate it. A trusted execution environment similarly partitions the CPU so that these algorithms can run in isolation from one another. And that partitioning continues in software terms to containers, which partition the system further. When a memory management unit is there to partition memory and processes in a multi-process system. RAM obfuscation makes it harder for a running device to be probed and manipulated whilst it's in operation. And right at the top end, we end up with things like differential power analysis or random time inserters, which are there to protect side channel attacks on the security of the system. And also at this level, we end up with anti-tamper, which is when a determined attacker physically attacks your device and is literally lifting chips or trying to interfere and probe into memory. They detect it and attempt and destroy the keys. So this sort of level of security really comes into its own for national infrastructure like vehicle to grid, or for money transaction like credit cards. So moving on, the next big choice, or another big choice, I should say, is OS selection. So this is a massive area, and frankly, we could do a full webinar just on this subject. But again, this is a set of trade-offs. And we'll start with one of the initial trade-offs is really whether what your application is. Does it need a user interface or not? So on the left-hand side, If you were a very simple use case like a tire pressure meter in a car, you'd probably want no OS at all, and it would just be a highly embedded device. At the other extreme, in the same car, you might have a head entertainment unit, which has got graphics and user input and video and animations and whatever else it might have. That's typically going to run a graphics framework, and you'd be looking more at Linux or Android with an MMU, tracing it back to the device. In the middle, in the car, you might have an engine control unit or a battery control unit nowadays or in the future. So you'd be looking more at a real hard real-time OS like Riot or FreeRTOS. Another consideration is how easy does the OS make it to access the security functions that are in your device, and because that will determine how much skills and effort and time it will take. So examples here are Embed allows access to memory protection units, Zephyr allows access to partitioning systems, whereas things like an MMU are typically found, MMUs and security kernels are typically found in Linux and Android at the other extreme. The last one I'm going to cover is device and support, really, and that's both a combination of is your device supported by this OS, and how easy is it to access suppliers that can help you along this journey. So Embed is largely supporting ARM devices from a lot of different manufacturers, whereas at the opposite extreme, Azure Sphere OS in one incarnation is a certified Linux-based operating system, which is supported by Microsoft until 2031 for a specific device. Ultimately, in OS selection, what we're looking for is modularity. Can we configure the features that we need? And also scalability. Will this OS be suitable for the range of devices that I'm releasing now and in the future? Okay, so the last area that I'm going to cover in this presentation is cloud selection. So ultimately, this is very context dependent. It depends on your application, your history, and the skills that you have, and your future plans. A decision in this area is going to live with you for a while, so you need to consider it carefully. Fundamentally, all of the big cloud providers, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, all support a core IoT. They all have key management, they all have onboarding, they all have secure communication. So really, we move to the next stage is there a cloud? Is the cloud that you're looking at, does it have a must-need integration that you need? Do you need SAP integration? Do you need Active Directory? Or are you looking more for the AI smarts and the Google federated ID? Or perhaps it's Alexa integration that you're looking for. So that might influence your decision. Similarly, the amount of development in these systems is quite large. So skills comes into play. It's what languages do you have access to, or do you have people in your organization? Do you have trusted partners that you work with? Time to market comes into play also. This is really if you have an integrated solution with a cloud and OS and devices, that can massively increase your time to market. So that's something to be considered. Ultimately, one of the things that's a big play here is total cost of ownership. The cost of ownership breaks down into four areas. It's the transaction costs, so it's the communication, it's the actual storage costs, and then key stores, and finally compute. But ultimately, what you have to do is you have to model your application, work out what it's going to be, and in order to assess what the ongoing cost of ownership is. So an example here is we did a analysis of secure key storage, and we were looking at a use case of 20 million devices per annum, each with 3 symmetric keys with a FIPS 120 hardware secured storage, and all the cloud providers that we looked at, it was costing less than about $1,000 per annum to manage that, whereas an on-site system was costing significantly more in capital equipment. Also in cloud is, so we've talked about the pure cloud providers, and then there's hosted, there's uh, um, uh, there's cloud agnostic suppliers of the other portion here. So Sphere, Sphere, yeah, Sphere. Sorry, MindSphere, apologies. MindSphere and Pelion are cloud agnostic, and those allow you, when you're looking at those, what you need to consider is that might allow you to do self-hosted, or perhaps allow you to implement a segregated air gap system for industrial IoT. But in those situations, if you do end up with a hybrid situation, you'll probably have to look at the cost of the platform independent one, and in addition to any cloud hosting that you have to do. So with that, I'm going to hand you back to Stuart, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about keys. Thank you.
Sorry about that, everyone. I was muted. Generally, when we're designing our IoT system, we want to achieve security right from a device all the way through to some server system that might well be implemented in the cloud. So we want that that unbroken chain of trust. And what's essential to that is keys. So I want to spend a little bit time talking about keys. As Rahul has already mentioned, a lot of the cloud solutions, be they from the public cloud, or be they the Pelion or MindSphere type solutions, do have key generation, so they will be able to generate the keys you need. But you still need to be able to decide what type of key it is you want, how many keys you want, and how long those keys are. So, what are the options? Well, if you've got a constrained device, you may be forced, because of the resource constraints, to only use symmetric cryptos. And if you're only using symmetric cryptos, then you're going to have a shared secret. That means the key in the server and the key in the device are going to be the same. So that shared secret needs to be protected. That's a key that needs to be locked away. It needs to be hidden, and it probably wants to be unique per device, so that if someone does compromise a device, they're only compromising that one key. Typically, in a lot of situations, you're going to use secure communications to a server, and you're going to authenticate that the server is genuine. And that's typically done with asymmetric cryptography, using a certificate that contains a public key. Now, in theory, the public key can be readable and could be shared across multiple devices, but it does need to be, it must be immutable. There must be no way to change that key. If you want an extra layer of security, and I think most applications would really go for this now, and certainly it's be what we would recommend, then you're looking for mutual authentication. And when you go for mutual authentication, you're essentially, not only is the device verifying it's talking to the correct server, but the server is verifying that it's talking to a genuine device. And again, that would typically use asymmetric cryptography. But the difference here is that we're going to have to put a private key inside the device. And again, that means that needs to be hidden, must not be readable. It also means that we probably, again, want to make that unique per device, so that if that key is ever compromised, we're only compromising one device. But that isn't the end of our considerations. We need to consider what cryptographic technology we're going to use and what the key lengths are going to be. And we need to be confident that they're going to be strong for the lifetime of the product. One of the things that we've found that can help, and that we've applied in some of our designs, and it's proved to be very useful actually, is to actually use, it's a little bit counterintuitive actually, is to use multiple keys. If you can break your system down into different areas of concern and use different cryptographic technologies with separate keys in those different areas, it actually simplifies things. And it also strengthens your security because you're reducing the number of attack vectors on one key. So we would certainly recommend that kind of approach. Now, once you've got your keys and you've decided on what your key strategy is, you should start probably thinking about production. Now, you may be in a situation where you've got your own secure factory, it's part of your organization, and perhaps this isn't a huge consideration for you. But for a lot of designers, a lot of people use a third party factory, and that might be in the Far East. And there we need to think about, well, do we need to security audit that factory? How secure are they? What other secure products have they produced? What is their reputation? Even then, even if we're satisfied that it's a secure factory and we trust them, we may want to limit the amount of sensitive data that we're sharing with that factory, and in particular, our keys. And we've developed for one of our customers, we developed a system to address this issue. It was a piece of specialist equipment that went in the factory and created a secure connection back to the key generation server. And this programmed the products on the production line. It meant that sensitive data was conveyed directly to the product and it wasn't shared more widely within the factory. It also meant they could track and verify exactly what keys were going into what product. So it's a good way of limiting some of that sensitive information that you're sharing. But it doesn't solve all the problems. We still need to consider what would happen if a product fails production test. That key should be revoked. And what happens if a product needs to be reworked? Maybe there's some damage, maybe the chip needs to be replaced and a fresh key needs to be inserted. So there's some operational aspects that need to be considered within the factory environment. Right, once we've considered production, we then move on to consider operation and update and the life cycle. Now, for me, lifecycle management and security go hand in hand. If you're not managing and monitoring your devices, it's very difficult to know that they're secure. So we need to consider how we're going to onboard devices onto the system, when they're first provisioned. We need to consider the monitoring and telemetry, what data we're going to get from those devices and how we might use that to see if anything adverse has happened to those devices. And we also want to think about how we're going to retire those devices when eventually they've reached the end of their life. And we have to offboard them from the system. Now, a key thing about lifecycle management is it provides the possibility for updates to devices, and updates are one of the areas that's likely to get mandated. So they're a very important benefit of lifecycle management, in my opinion. But the other area that's been mandated is a vulnerability disclosure policy. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about what a vulnerability disclosure policy is. Right, well, the first thing to say about a vulnerability disclosure policy is you're going to have to do some preparation. It's going to have to happen as part of the design phase. You're going to have to be thinking about policies, getting some documents, assigning responsibilities to certain people or teams within your organization in advance of releasing your product. You can break the vulnerability disclosure down into a number of steps. The first part is about awareness of vulnerabilities. So the vulnerabilities, your awareness can come from different sources. And one of the things that you have to do is provide a means for security researchers to be able to contact you. And this may have to be secure because they may want to share some sensitive data with you about a vulnerability. But in my opinion, and you may get some be made aware of some very important vulnerabilities that way. But in my opinion, you're probably going to find out about more vulnerabilities from suppliers and from organizations that are collecting vulnerabilities about the other components within your system. So it's very important that we're monitoring the open source forums, we're monitoring the security databases, and we're in contact with our suppliers to know about what vulnerabilities they've found in the components that we've integrated into our system. And When doing this, it's helpful if you've maintained a software bomb. And a software bomb is essentially a list of all the software components that are in your system with their version. And it gives you a quick way of checking that if a vulnerability is going to affect your product. The next stage that we would normally consider once is how we're going to deal with this vulnerability once we're aware of it, and we need to have a plan of action for this. If we've been told by a security researcher, we need to acknowledge that. He needs to know that we're doing something with that information. We then probably want to verify, okay, is this vulnerability actually affecting us? So we've got some verification to do, and then we need to think about remediation. What are we going to do? Is it just an operational thing that needs to change? Do we need to do an update, or do we just need to do some kind of a password reset? What's the remediation? And then finally, we need to be thinking about our downstream communication and being good citizens within the security environment. So we need to be telling our customers, we need to be perhaps telling other stakeholders. If we can't contact our customers, maybe we're talking to some industry bodies. And certainly if we found a systemic issue, very important that we let some industry bodies know. Right. Right. We started this webinar talking about will your new IoT device break your business? Well, I think if you've got an insecure product, clearly that can do an awful lot of harm to your business. So what we would recommend is that you do adopt secure by design and you adopt a full life cycle security mindset and protect your business that way. Regulation is imminent. We can see that it's coming in the UK, it's coming in Europe, it's already there in the US. So we would recommend that, and if you're not compliant with the regulation, that could limit your access to markets, and that can obviously be harmful to business. So we would recommend that people start complying with the code of practice now. We'd actually recommend embracing all 13 guidelines, and that way you're future-proofing your products and your business against this going forward. But you can have too much security, as Matt mentioned, and it can add unnecessary cost and complexity. So we need to plan to implement proportionate security, and that's a judgment that you'll have to make, and it's an important judgment. And finally, security experience is hard won. It takes time. Mistakes can be costly. So if you don't have that experience, we would recommend working with an experienced partner to reduce risk and accelerate your time to market. Okay, hopefully we'll have time for some questions, but just before we get on to the questions, I'd just like to draw your attention to a couple of infographics on our website. I think you can see the URL there. They summarize a lot of the information. There's a helpful checklist as well. So if you found this interesting, I think you'll find the infographics very informative.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stuart. That was a really good presentation. I think we've got time for some questions, so we'll dive in because the audience has been tapping away. First question, I think I'll ask that to Rahul. Is my device more or less secure if not connected to the internet and it only interacts through Bluetooth, low energy and near field communications with a user's smartphone? What's your view on that?
So I would say actually it's about the same really. It all that you're doing there by not connecting it directly to the internet is you're just swapping a few of the attack surfaces. So you really need to look at it. The attack surface of Bluetooth and via the phone is still valid. So it may be harder to do, but you could imagine a malign actor creating a malformed Bluetooth or NFC transaction and causing your IoT device to malfunction. So ultimately, you still have to do the same analysis, attack surface analysis, and put in the contingencies for how you're going to handle it and what sort of security that you're going to put in place. So I'm afraid it still exists.
Thank you. I think the next question will be for you, Stuart. When do you think the regulations are likely to kick in, and what might they look like?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. So, I mean, before we had the COVID situation that we've all been living through, then the government plan was to bring in a scheme this year. We don't know the exact details of that scheme, but it was going to be a trust mark scheme for the UK. So what the timescales are now, I can't be sure. I mean, they could still surprise us, and maybe something will come out this year. I believe that there is a proposal for a certification framework within the EU. I don't know what the timescales of that, of going through the EU processes are. And obviously, we've already got regulation in the US, but recently the FCC have started further discussions around IoT security. So there's a chance that will lead to more regulation in the US as well. Matt, I don't know if you've got any updates on what's happening on the regulatory side.
Nothing more beyond that. I think it's obviously the US is there or thereabouts, and things coming through in other markets. But typically, it's voluntary codes of practice rather than actual hard and fast regulations. But they're clearly coming.
I'd like to pick up on that actually, both all of you, in fact. Is regulation needed to kind of force organisations' hands? We've talked about all the risks involved. And isn't this something that people just want to do themselves, would want to do themselves anyway, to protect their business and their customers?
They may well want to do it themselves. I suggest that they, up to now, they haven't been tremendously good in many cases at putting together things that are particularly secure, as evidenced by a number of the hacks that we've seen in the past. And it has a knock-on effect for everybody. It sours the well for everybody. Yeah,
thanks, Matt. Great. Next question has come in. I think this one will be for Stuart as well. It's about the notion of a situation that is security critical, and how difficult is that to manage with both OT and IT?
Okay, I mean that's an interesting question actually, because I think that IoT can be challenging for organizations sometimes, because it kind of, I think Matt touched on this at the beginning. Often it's something that's seen because it's something that the IT department are involved in, but often ultimately it's something that will be used operationally. So it can end up in a space that's somewhere between OT and IT. And I think what has to happen in those situations, I think organizations need to step back a little bit and think about how they're going to use it, who's going to be responsible for updates, who's going to be responsible for maintaining this, and what the effect is going to be on their organization. And it wouldn't surprise me if in a lot of cases what this really means is that they need to just slightly change their organization in order to get the most out of IoT. So I think it kind of moves into a wider digital transformation piece.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stuart. I guess I think we've got time for one more question actually. The question is, what's the role of security evaluation and penetration testing here? And I think, Stuart, it would be good again if you could get the ball rolling on that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I suppose it might sound a bit glib, but they do say, you shouldn't mark your own homework. And that is true. With the best will in the world, you may have some oversight. So I think getting a second pair of eyes, getting some security experts in, and we've done this regularly, certainly in the set-top box world, it's pretty much standard practice. And then they'll find, they'll pick up something that you hadn't seen. So it's very worthwhile. Penetration testing slightly different. I mean, some of these stacks that you're going to incorporate, they're very complicated. There's a tremendous they offer a tremendous amount of test space, but there are a lot of known vulnerabilities, and there's companies out there that are maintaining databases of these known vulnerabilities and quickly give you a good idea of whether you're susceptible, and that can be a good way of giving you confidence and saving you a lot of time. So they've definitely got a role to play.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stuart. I think actually you were quite succinct, so we're squeezing an absolutely final question. The question is, could you share what IoT application would require asymmetric cryptography?
I think that's a whole question, actually.
So thanks, Stu. This is really about sort of system design. So asymmetric keys are normally used when you're trying to do attestation, prove who you are. And if you had asymmetric key structure in place on your device, what you could actually do is the device can certify that it is itself and that it has been untouched, and deliver that back. And that can be verified at very low cost by any receiving party, because to have the public key of the device has no security implication. So if you model your system that way, it makes the distribution of the information um, less makes it secure at one end or the other, and you design your system really to optimize what your cost, what your use case and what your cost is going to be. So it's a choice.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time, so it only remains to thank today's speakers, Stuart Griffin and Rahul Mehra from Consult Red, and of course Matt Hatton from Transformer Insights. I should point out that the entire webinar will be available to listen to at your leisure. Again, tell your friends. That will be at iotnow.com. And also, I would urge you to check out Consult Red's infographic, which has loads of data, and also, of course, the very important checklist. Thanks also to the audience for joining us today and for your stimulating questions. We look forward to welcoming you to another IoT webinar soon. Thanks again, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay safe and secure.